Welcome to Life Stories. What would you do if you overheard a secret that could change someone's life forever? Would you walk away? Or would you risk everything to tell the truth? Today's story is about trust, betrayal, and an act of courage that turned a simple waitress into an unexpected hero. When Jessica overhears a shocking conversation, she faces a choice that will alter the fate of millionaire Ethan Carter. What happens next is a journey of deception, redemption, and life-changing decisions. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's story. There are moments in life when a single choice can alter the course of everything. A decision, seemingly small, can shift destinies, unravel betrayals, and set into motion a chain of events that no one could have foreseen. This is one of those stories. It is about trust, deception, and the unexpected ways in which kindness can come back in ways we never expect. It all began on a quiet afternoon in a cafe in New York City. The kind of place where polished businessmen gathered over espresso and deals worth millions were sealed with a handshake. Ethan Carter, a self-made millionaire, sat at a corner table, adjusting the cufflinks on his tailored suit, his mind filled with thoughts of the momentous occasion ahead. Across from him sat Brandon, his closest friend and business partner, a man he had trusted for years, someone he had built his empire with from the ground up. Today was supposed to be a celebration. The finalization of their latest deal was within reach. And with it, the future of their company seemed more secure than ever. The atmosphere in the cafe hummed with quiet sophistication. Waiters moved with practiced grace. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, and the clinking of silverware provided a comforting rhythm to the afternoon. Everything was as it should be, at least on the surface. Ethan stood from his chair, stretching slightly. "I'm going to use the restroom," he said, smiling at Brandon, who barely looked up from his phone. Nodding absent-mindedly, Ethan walked away with a sense of satisfaction. It had been years of hard work, of long nights and strategic risks, but it was all worth it. Together, he and Brandon had built something remarkable, and this deal was just the beginning of even greater things to come. But while Ethan was away, something happened. Something that would change everything. Jessica, a waitress at the cafe, had been working there for a few months. She was quiet, unassuming, the kind of person who blended into the background. She had learned to keep her head down, to move through the space unnoticed, listening without truly hearing, watching without truly seeing. But today, she couldn't help herself. As she approached the table to refill Brandon's water, she heard him speaking in a low voice, his phone pressed to his ear. At first, she didn't pay attention, it wasn't her business. But then, something about his tone made her pause. And before she could stop herself, she caught the words that sent a chill down her spine. "Everything is set. Ethan has no idea. Once the deal goes through, I'll have control of everything. By the time he realizes what's happening, it'll be too late. I've been planning this for months. The company, the assets, it's all going to be mine." Jessica felt the glass in her hand tremble slightly, the weight of what she had just heard settling heavily in her chest. She took a step back, heart pounding, willing herself to breathe. Had she really just heard that? Had she misunderstood? But the confidence in Brandon's voice, the casual way he spoke of his betrayal, left little room for doubt. For a few agonizing moments, she hesitated. What was she supposed to do? She was just a waitress, a stranger to these men and their world. But something inside her wouldn't let her walk away. She thought about Ethan, the man she had seen in the cafe so many times before. Always polite, always gracious with the staff, someone who carried himself with quiet dignity. Did he deserve this? To be deceived by his closest friend? By the time Ethan returned to the table, Jessica had made her decision. Her pulse quickened as she saw Brandon lean back in his chair, greeting Ethan with a wide, effortless smile, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just plotted to steal everything. She swallowed hard. Moments later, as Brandon stepped outside to take a call, Jessica knew this was her only chance. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward Ethan's table, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Carter," she said, her hands gripping the tray she was holding. Ethan looked up, surprised that a waitress was addressing him directly. "Yes." Jessica hesitated, her heart racing. But there was no turning back now. "I overheard something. Something you need to know." Ethan Carter frowned, setting down his coffee cup, his sharp blue eyes studying Jessica with quiet curiosity. He had spent years building his business, navigating high-stakes negotiations, and reading people in the process. The way Jessica stood before him, her fingers tightening around the tray, the flicker of hesitation in her eyes, told him that whatever she was about to say, it wasn't trivial. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice calm, but edged with concern. Jessica glanced toward the entrance where Brandon had stepped outside, then back at Ethan, her voice lowering as if afraid the very walls could betray her. I heard your friend on the phone," she admitted, swallowing hard. "He's planning to take everything from you once the deal is finalized. He said you had no idea and that by the time you realized what was happening, it would be too late." For a moment, Ethan just stared at her, the words not fully sinking in. It was an absurd claim. Brandon, the man who had been by his side through everything, the same person who had once helped him through his toughest years. The idea was ridiculous. It had to be a mistake. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his tone still composed. But there was something else beneath it now, a flicker of unease. Jessica nodded, her hands gripping the tray so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "I wouldn't be telling you this if I wasn't sure." Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind racing. A part of him wanted to dismiss it outright, to reassure himself that Jessica had misunderstood, that there was no way Brandon would betray him. But another part, the part that had been trained to notice patterns, inconsistencies, and the smallest shifts in behavior, refused to let it go. He had trusted Brandon for years. But trust, he knew, was a dangerous thing. It could blind a person, make them vulnerable. And vulnerability in the business world was a weakness that could be exploited. Ethan glanced toward the entrance, where Brandon was still deep in conversation, pacing the sidewalk, unaware of the storm brewing inside. His mind replayed the past few weeks, Brandon's subtle urgency to push the deal forward, his increasing involvement in negotiations, the way he had insisted that Ethan leave the details to him. Doubt crept in, unraveling the certainty Ethan had once had in his friend. "Thank you," he finally said, his voice quieter now, controlled. "I appreciate you telling me this." Jessica nodded, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly, though the worry in her eyes remained. She knew she had done the right thing, but now it was out of her hands. As she stepped away, Ethan remained still, his fingers tapping idly against the edge of the table. His appetite had disappeared, replaced by a gnawing unease that wouldn't let go. Brandon walked back inside moments later, slipping his phone into his pocket with an easy smile. "All right. Where were we?" he said, settling back into his seat, his tone as relaxed as ever. Ethan forced himself to return the smile, masking the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. "Just going over the details again," he said smoothly, lifting his coffee cup to his lips, though the taste now felt bitter. If what Jessica had said was true, then signing this deal could be the biggest mistake of his life. But Ethan wasn't the kind of man who made mistakes. Not without a fight. And certainly not without knowing all the facts. Ethan Carter walked out of the cafe that afternoon with a smile still painted on his face. But inside, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The moment Jessica had spoken those words to him, something had shifted. Trust, once solid as stone, had cracked just enough to let suspicion creep in. Brandon had looked so at ease when he returned to the table, completely unaware that his secret had been exposed. He had laughed, made small talk, and even joked about how smooth the final stages of their deal were going. Ethan had played along, nodding, smiling, sipping his coffee, but every word Brandon spoke felt tainted now. Was it possible? Had he really been so blind? Ethan had spent years building his empire with Brandon, making sacrifices, grinding through setbacks, and celebrating victories together. The idea that Brandon had been planning to betray him, to rip everything out from under him, was almost unfathomable. Almost. But Ethan hadn't gotten to where he was by ignoring warning signs. By the time he reached his office in Manhattan, he had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to act on Jessica's warning blindly, but he wasn't going to dismiss it either. Seated behind his massive oak desk, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for, Jake Calloway. Jake had been his go-to private investigator for years. Someone who operated in the shadows but always delivered results. Ethan trusted him not just because of his skills but because of his discretion. And right now, discretion was exactly what he needed. He tapped the number. And after a few rings, Jake's gruff voice came through the line. "Carter. What's going on?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the city skyline through the glass windows of his office. "I need you to look into someone for me." There was a pause. "Personal or business?" Ethan hesitated, then exhaled. "Both." "Who?" "Brandon Hale." The name tasted bitter on his tongue now. Jake let out a low whistle. "Your business partner? That's unexpected. What am I looking for?" "Anything out of the ordinary," Ethan said. "Financial movements. Unusual meetings. Offshore accounts. If there's something there, I need to know." Another pause. Then Jake's voice came back. Steady and confident. "Got it. Give me a few days." Ethan ended the call and tossed his phone onto the desk, rubbing his temples. He didn't know what he was hoping for, whether he wanted Jake to come back empty-handed so he could dismiss Jessica's warning as a misunderstanding, or whether he wanted proof, something concrete to justify the unease now sitting like a stone in his stomach. For the next few days, Ethan tried to act normal. He met with Brandon for routine business discussions, attended investor meetings, and even shared a drink with him one evening at their usual lounge, where Brandon laughed and toasted to their future success. But now, every interaction was under a microscope. Ethan watched Brandon more carefully than ever, looking for cracks in his facade, inconsistencies in his words, any sign that he was indeed hiding something. And then, on the third day, Jake called. "I found something," Jake said, his voice steady but carrying a weight of urgency. Ethan sat up in his chair, his pulse quickening. "Tell me." "There are some irregularities in Brandon's financial records. Unexplained transfers. He's been moving money into an offshore account for months." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "How much?" "Not massive amounts at first. Small, careful withdrawals. But they've been increasing lately. Enough to make you wonder. And the timing is interesting, it lines up almost exactly with when you two started negotiating this new deal." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. The pieces were starting to fall into place. And the picture they painted was one of betrayal. His oldest friend had been planning this for months. Ethan opened his eyes, jaw tightening. "Keep digging," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel. He needed more than suspicions. He needed proof. And once he had it, Brandon was going to learn the hard way that Ethan Carter wasn't a man to be deceived. Ethan Carter barely slept that night. The weight of Jake's words pressed against his chest like a heavy stone, making it impossible to find peace. He had spent years trusting Brandon, believing in their partnership, their shared vision. And now, the realization that Brandon had been slowly, methodically positioning himself for betrayal was sinking in like poison. By morning, his resolve had hardened. He wouldn't lash out recklessly. This wasn't about anger. It was about strategy. If Brandon had spent months preparing his deception, Then Ethan needed to be just as meticulous in his response. The day passed in a blur of meetings and forced conversations. He played his part flawlessly, listening to Brandon discuss the upcoming deal with enthusiasm, nodding at the right moments, feigning excitement for a future that, as far as Brandon knew, Ethan was still blind to. But beneath the surface, every word, every gesture, felt hollow. That evening, Ethan decided it was time to set the trap. He invited Brandon to dinner at an exclusive private club they often frequented, a place that had always been a sanctuary for them, a space where they had celebrated countless victories together. It was ironic. In a way, tonight, it would become the setting for the ultimate confrontation. Brandon arrived looking as confident as ever, his tailored suit crisp, his smile easy, as if he hadn't been plotting to destroy everything they had built. "Man, I swear, we are on the verge of something incredible," he said, clapping Ethan on the shoulder as they settled into their seats. "This deal is going to change everything." Ethan poured them both a glass of whiskey, swirling the amber liquid in his glass before finally meeting Brandon's gaze. "Yeah," he said smoothly, tilting his head slightly. "That's what I've been thinking too. We've worked hard for this moment." Brandon grinned, raising his glass. "To the future." Ethan mirrored his movement, but the toast left a bitter taste in his mouth. He set his glass down, fingers tapping lightly against the table. "I had an interesting conversation the other day," he said casually, watching for Brandon's reaction. Brandon leaned back, sipping his drink. "Oh yeah? About what?" Ethan studied him for a beat before saying. "About offshore accounts. About secret transfers. About business partners who aren't exactly what they seem." Brandon's hand froze mid-motion, the whiskey glass hovering near his lips. It was subtle, just a flicker of hesitation. A moment of delayed reaction, but for Ethan, it was enough. The mask was starting to slip. Brandon recovered quickly, letting out a short laugh as he set his drink down. "What are you getting at, Ethan?" His voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it now. A careful calculation. Ethan leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "I know, Brandon. I know about the money you've been moving. The accounts. The fact that you've been positioning yourself to take over the company once this deal goes through." He let the words settle, watching as Brandon's expression shifted from mild amusement to something darker. For a long moment, there was silence. The din of conversation around them continued. Glasses clinking, soft laughter filling the air. But between them, a quiet storm was brewing. Finally, Brandon exhaled, shaking his head. "So, you've been spying on me?" Ethan arched a brow. "You've been stealing from me." Brandon's smile was gone now, replaced by something more calculating. "It's not stealing, Ethan," he said, his tone lower now, sharper. "It's survival. You think I haven't noticed how this company works? How you get all the credit while I do the heavy lifting? I built this just as much as you did. And yet, I'm the one in your shadow. Always." Ethan clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath the surface. "So instead of talking to me, you decided to take what wasn't yours?" Brandon's eyes flashed with something close to resentment. "You wouldn't have listened. You never do." Ethan shook his head, leaning back in his chair. "You're wrong. I would have listened. But now you've destroyed everything." Brandon scoffed, reaching for his drink again, his composure returning. "You don't have proof," he said smoothly. "Just speculation." Ethan allowed himself a small smile. "That's where you're wrong. I have everything. Every transfer. Every conversation. I've frozen the accounts. You have nothing." Brandon. For the first time, true fear flickered across Brandon's face. His grip on the glass tightened, his jaw clenching as he processed the realization that his plan had fallen apart. Ethan stood, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. "You should leave," he said calmly. "And don't ever come near my company again." Brandon didn't move right away. He sat there, gripping his drink like it was the last bit of control he had left. And then, slowly, he rose to his feet, his eyes dark with fury. "You'll regret this," he murmured. Ethan met his gaze, unwavering. "No, Brandon. The only thing I regret is ever trusting you." Without another word, Brandon turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind the remnants of a shattered friendship. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of betrayal settle over him. It was over. But at what cost? Ethan Carter sat alone at the restaurant table long after Brandon had stormed out, his glass of whiskey untouched, his thoughts a tangled mess of emotions. The weight of betrayal sat heavy on his chest, pressing down with an intensity that left him feeling drained. He had spent years believing in Brandon, trusting him, building something that he thought was unbreakable. And now, in a matter of moments, everything had changed. The company was safe for now. Brandon's accounts were frozen, his plan exposed, and whatever power he thought he had over the business had slipped through his fingers. But that didn't erase the sting of the betrayal. It didn't undo the years of friendship, the memories of late nights working together, the celebrations, the shared victories. Ethan had lost more than just a business partner tonight. He had lost someone he had once considered family. As he sat in silence, his mind drifted back to the one person who had set everything in motion, Jessica, the waitress who had risked everything to warn him. If she hadn't spoken up that day, if she had chosen to stay silent like so many others might have, Ethan would have walked straight into Brandon's trap. He would have signed the deal, unknowingly handing over control of everything he had built. He owed her more than just gratitude. The next afternoon, Ethan made his way to the cafe where Jessica worked. It was a stark contrast to the sleek offices and high-end boardrooms he was used to. The place smelled of coffee and fresh pastries, a warm and familiar scent that carried none of the tension that had gripped him for the past few days. He spotted Jessica at the far end of the cafe, balancing a tray as she moved between tables, her focus sharp, her movements quick. She hadn't noticed him yet. Ethan waited until she was done with a table before stepping forward. "Jessica." She turned, startled, her brown eyes widening slightly when she saw him. "Mr. Carter," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. I didn't expect to see you here." Ethan smiled, though there was still a heaviness in his chest. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, "for what you did. You didn't have to get involved. But you did. And because of you, I was able to stop something that could have ruined me." Jessica hesitated, looking almost embarrassed. I couldn't ignore it. I knew it wasn't my place. But I couldn't stand by and let someone be deceived like that." Ethan studied her for a moment. She wasn't looking for praise. She hadn't done it for recognition or reward. She had simply done what was right, even though it could have cost her everything. That kind of integrity was rare. "You mentioned before that you had to leave school to take care of your mother," he said. "Is that something you'd want to go back to if you had the chance?" Jessica blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in conversation. "I mean, of course. But college isn't exactly cheap. And my mom still needs help." Ethan nodded. "I'd like to help you with that." Her brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'll cover the costs for you to go back to school. And if you're interested, I'd like to offer you a position at my company," Ethan said, watching her reaction carefully. "You have good instincts, Jessica. You saw what was happening before I did. And I think you could do great things if given the chance." Jessica stared at him, her mouth slightly open, as if she wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. You'd do that?" Ethan nodded. "You changed my life by telling me the truth. Now I want to give you the chance to change yours." For the first time since the conversation started, her eyes glistened slightly, but she quickly blinked it away, shaking her head in disbelief. "I don't even know what to say." Ethan smiled. "Then just say yes." Jessica let out a breath, then nodded. a slow smile spreading across her face. Yes. Absolutely. Yes. And just like that, a new chapter began. Jessica's life changed in ways she never imagined. With Ethan's support, she returned to school, balancing her studies while working at his company. At first, she felt out of place, stepping into a world so different from the cafe where she had spent her days. But she quickly proved herself, her sharp instincts, strong work ethic, and ability to see what others overlooked made her a valuable asset to the team. Ethan, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. The betrayal by Brandon had left scars, but it had also shown him the importance of surrounding himself with people of integrity. Jessica became someone he could trust, someone who reminded him that honesty and courage were still worth believing in. Over time, their professional relationship grew into something deeper. They shared late nights at the office, bouncing ideas off each other, finding comfort in the quiet moments when work wasn't just about business but about making a difference. Ethan had lost a friend in Brandon, but in Jessica, he had gained an ally, one who had stood by him when it mattered most. As the months passed, Jessica's career flourished, and Ethan's company grew stronger than ever. The betrayal had been painful, but in the end, it had led to something better. Sometimes, life had a way of turning even the darkest moments into opportunities for growth. And so, their story continued, a story of trust, redemption, and the unexpected rewards of doing the right thing. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring content. Stay tuned for our next video.